Hello there, this is Juliana Michaels and I'm thrilled to be here with you on the Ranger Ink YouTube channel. In this video, I'm using the Tim Holtz alcohol neon inks to create a bright and cheerful card with a touch of grunge. Yes, neon can go grungy. I'm going to walk you through the process step by step and show you just how easy it is to do. Now let's get into it. So for this card and the techniques I'm going to be sharing, I'm going to be focusing on some of the new alcohol neons, and the colors I'm going to be working with are Radioactive, Ignite, and Razzle. Then the other mediums I'm going to be working with, I'm going to be using alcohol ink Smudge and then some alcohol blending solution. When you're working with the alcohol neons, you definitely want to use the blending solution so that it will more permanently adhere the pigments that are in these to your paper. Otherwise, they tend to rub off if you try to use just regular rubbing alcohol. And then I like to put the blending solution in just a smaller craft bottle that has a little bit finer tip. The other mediums I've got here are the Dina Wakley gloss spray in black, and then I've got some embossing ink and white embossing powder, translucent texture paste, and then archival ink in black soot. The paper I'm going to be working on is the alcohol ink Yupo paper. And then some of the tools that you're going to need is an air blower and a palette knife. And then I'm also going to be working with some stencils and stamps and die cuts to embellish the card and for the techniques on the background. So the stencil I'm working with is the Tim Holtz linked circles. And I'm going to use the Tim Holtz Vault Scribbly Butterflies die set. And then I've got the two of the mixed media stamp and stencil sets, and I'm going to be using some of the stamps from these. So this is mixed media 44 and 15. So when it comes to the Yupo paper, these come in 5x7 sheets, so a lot of times I just like to cut those in half and use that to create my card background. And then we're going to grab our alcohol neons and the blending solution. And because these are pigment based, you just want to give them a little bit of a shake just to kind of get the color and pigment mixed in with the alcohol. And then from there, I'm just going to go and add some of the color to my background here. Just kind of adding a few drops of the Razzle. I'll add some of the Ignite. And then a little bit of the Radioactive. And then if you feel like you need a little bit more, you can always add a little bit more. And then now I'm going to add the blending solution, and I'm just going to kind of apply that liberally over the surface here, getting a good coverage of it. And then I'm going to take the air blower tool and use that to kind of help mix and blend that blending solution into the inks. And I'm just very gently squeezing it. I'm not giving it CPR or anything, just very gentle, small little puffs of air. And then just continuing to blow that and move it around, kind of coming at it from different angles. If you feel like I said, if you want to add a little bit more, you can. Definitely prefer adding it while that blending solution is still wet, because then the colors are going to continue to blend and give you that flowy effect. Once the blending solution starts to dry, the colors aren't going to move as well, and so it's going to be a little bit harder to get that real nice flowy effect. You're going to get more of the kind of cell type formations with it. And once you get it where you're happy with it, sometimes I'll just like use my craft pick to kind of get underneath the corner and then just pick that up. And then you're going to want to set this to the side and let it dry. And if you're kind of getting some of that pooling along the edge, you can use your blower to kind of move that around a little bit. And then depending on how thick you've applied the alcohol inks and the blending solution, and the humidity where you are, this can take a little bit of time for this to dry. So just give yourself time to let this sit to the side and dry for a while until it's no longer sticky. And then as far as cleanup goes, you can just use a little bit of some rubbing alcohol, or even hand sanitizer will work, and then just wipe off your glass mat, because you do want to make sure you're working on a glass mat when you're working with these alcohol inks. And then I like to take that towel and then just kind of wipe off my nozzles so that the lids don't stick as bad. And then just kind of make sure that you're getting the same color lid back onto the bottle. I usually get some ink in the cap, so that kind of helps. I'll look down in there and see the color, and I know I'm getting the right one, so that you know, kind of contaminate the tip. And then we're just going to let that alcohol ink background dry before we move on to the next step. And then while that other background's drying, we're going to take another piece of the Yupo paper and the Razzle alcohol neon, and we're just going to apply some of that to the paper. And I'm going to add some of the blending solution. I'm going to take the air blower and just get those color flowing and moving across the background. And we're going to be using this piece to do some die cutting. So I just wanted to use one color. And kind of just have that color be the main focus on this panel. And you just need a piece large enough for the die cutting you're going to be doing. So it doesn't necessarily need to even be this size, depending on what kind of die cut you're using. And then we can set this to the side and let it dry as well. Once your background is dry, then you're going to take your stencil and some of the texture paste translucent. And then you're going to use your palette knife to just scrape out some of the texture paste onto the back of your knife. And then you're just going to line your stencil up onto your paper wherever you want your pattern. And I'm just going to kind of apply this kind of at a little bit of a diagonal. I'm not going for full coverage or anything kind of perfect. I just want a little bit kind of down through the center to add a little bit of texture and interest to this background. As far as selecting a stencil to work with for this technique, I just recommend some sort of stencil that has a lot of openings and kind of smaller sections that are solid. So just something like this that kind of has those more openings. And then just gently peel off that stencil. You're going to set this to the side and let it dry. And then you just want to clean your stencil immediately before the paste dries on there. So as far as the paste drying on the alcohol ink and plastic paper, it will eventually dry. It's just going to take a little bit of time, depending again on the humidity and temperature there where you live, and also how thick you apply it. So if you've applied it thicker than this, it's going to take a little longer. So just kind of keep that in mind. But again, you can go and work on other parts of the card while you're waiting for this to dry. So now I'm going to stamp the sentiment. I've just got a piece of black cardstock here. I'm going to be using this Mixed Media Stamp Stencil Set 44 and one of the sentiments from it. I'm just going to position that on my paper there. And you can use a stamping platform or a stamping block, whichever you prefer. And then I'm going to ink that up with some embossing ink. Tap that on there and then stamp that over onto my paper. If you need to re-ink it again, especially if you're using a stamping platform, you can. And then I'm going to place a piece of printer paper here, folded in half underneath. And then I'm going to pour the white embossing powder over the top here. And then just gently tap off any excess. If you've got a few little pieces here and there that are sticking, you could use a little small paintbrush to wipe those away, and then just gentle taps to knock them off. And you can use this paper to help pour that powder back into the jar. And then from there, I'm just going to use my heat gun to melt the embossing powder. So you just want to turn that on and let it warm up, and then just kind of keep it moving over the powder until you see that it starts melting and getting shiny. So once the embossing powder is completely melted, then you just let that cool for a second, and then you can use your scissors or a paper trimmer to trim this out into a little strip. Now the next step then is you're going to take the Vault Scribbly Butterfly die, and you're going to cut the more detailed scribbly design from a piece of black cardstock. And then the more solid piece you're going to use to die cut that alcohol inked background that we did with just the Razzle. And you can just kind of position that on there wherever you like the design, or if you're wanting to save the paper and use it for something else, you could, you know, maybe cut it down on one end, and then you could cut a second butterfly from that same piece if you used a larger piece. So once the paste is dry, we're going to take this stamp from the Mixed Media Set 15, and we're going to use some of the Black Soot archival ink. We're just going to ink up the stamp. Either ink it that way, or you can push it down into the ink here. We're going to use our fingers to use the stamp, because I want to just be able to add a little bit of stamping kind of here and there on the background. So I'm just going to kind of lightly touch it down into these areas that are open without paste. I'm not really trying to stamp onto the paste so much. So I'm just going to add little bits of the ink here and there. If you need a little more ink, you just kind of re-ink it, stamp again. Let's just add a little bit of interest there. I'm going to do a little bit of that on this other side here. I'm just kind of moving it to different sections as I move the stamp along the paper so that I can get ink, so that I can get different parts of the stamp that still have ink on them. And if you find like there's some areas that are like, oh, I wish it was a little bit darker, you can kind of line the stamp up and stamp back over it if you need to. Okay, well, like I said, just kind of adding a little bit of texture and interest there to the background. And then once you're finished with the stamp, you can use the archival ink cleaner to clean that ink off if you like. The ink will still stain the stamp, but it will remove most of the ink. And then you're just going to let that ink dry, which shouldn't take too long. So then the next step we're going to do is we're going to add some splatters to the background, and we're going to use the Dina Wakley gloss spray. And you just want to make sure you give that a good shake and get all of the pigment and everything mixed in real well. And then if you want to use a splatter brush, you can, or you can just unscrew the cap and use the nozzle and straw and just get some ink onto the end of the straw tip, and then just tap to create the splatters. And you can just keep adding splatters as you like. And then again, you're just going to set this to the side to dry. And then the final step, if you want to add a little bit more grunge to this, you could certainly leave it as is, because it does create quite a beautiful background with those vibrant neons. However, I'm not quite this much of a bright person. So another option you can do is take another alcohol ink, such as Smudge, which is a real pale color, and then just very carefully, you're going to place the tip in the areas that are open where there's not paste. And just add a little drop and let that ink flow where it goes. I'm not even really squeezing the bottle hardly when I do this. Now, if you find that this is a little harder for you to control, what you could do is put some alcohol in a palette and then maybe use a small brush to apply the alcohol ink. But like I said, I'm just kind of tapping it into the open areas that don't have the paste. So it's going on to where there was some of the alcohol ink. Paste is acting kind of as a resist, so because the alcohol ink, when you're dabbing it through there, is not getting underneath the paste. So just kind of continue that process. Obviously, if you wanted a more bold contrast, you could use a different color. I just wanted a real subtle touch of the grunge with this. I'm just going to kind of continue that across the background here and there. And you can always add a little bit more if you want it a little bit darker, kind of get a little layering of it there. And just continue that process until you're happy with how it looks. But I really love how it helps the stencil work and the texture paste kind of pop a little bit more. So then from there, again, you're just going to set this to the side and let it dry. And then this panel is finished and ready to use on your card. And so then to finish off the card, I just adhered it to a piece of black cardstock, added the die cut butterfly and the sentiment, and then adhered those with some double-sided foam adhesive just to give it a little bit of dimension. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the inspiration and techniques I shared using the Tim Holtz alcohol neon inks and are inspired to give them a try. You can find a list of the supplies with links that I used to create this card in the description box below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with all the inspiration from Ranger Ink. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.